We've all heard the stories about Colombia, how dangerous it is, the cartels, the coffee obsession, salsa dancing everywhere, and so much more. But how much of it is actually true? Which ones are outdated and which ones are just plain wrong? Stick around because today I'm busting 10 of the craziest, silliest, and funniest myths and stereotypes about this amazing country. Some might shock you, some might make you laugh, and a few, well, you'll just have to see for yourself. Let's dive right in. Now, as an Australian that has lived in Colombia for over 12 years. If Colombia was really as bad as what you might have heard it is, I probably wouldn't still be here, would I? So let's go over some of these common myths and let's see if we can find out what is true, what's real, and what's false. Okay, starting with myth number one. Colombia is all about coffee and the other C stuff. Let's just call it the devil's dandruff. But let's be real about this topic. Of course, Colombia does have a reputation for being one of the biggest producers in the world of that stuff, but that's just one aspect of Colombia. It's a shame that it's still that way, but Colombia is known for so much more than just that one negative thing. Colombia grows the best coffee in the world, literally, and there really is so much more to this country than just those negative things that you hear about it. From cutting-edge technology hubs to a thriving art scene and world-class cuisine, Colombia's identity goes far beyond these old cliches. And did you know Colombia is also one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, second only to Brazil? Due to the huge variety of terrains and weather conditions and landscapes, there are so many different animals and plant species that exist here that you can't find anywhere else in the world. And that's why I've made so many videos about fruits in Colombia recently, because there are fruits here that I've never seen anywhere else in the world. And I highly recommend, if you come to Colombia, please make it a priority to taste as many of them as you can, because they're amazing. And if you get the chance to go and visit places like the Amazon, I highly recommend it. Just choose your timing well, because it can be very hot and humid and rainy at certain times of year. There are some other beautiful areas as well, like the tropical coast of the Caribbean and the Pacific coast. But if you prefer the cooler weather, then you can go to areas that are at higher elevations, like capital city Bogota, which is actually quite cool all year round, and you might need a jacket when you're there. I choose to live in Medellin because it's the city of eternal spring, and the weather here is pretty much amazing all year round. I just love it. It's never too cold, never too hot. Number two is a funny little myth. Everyone in Colombia dances salsa. And let me say, that is false. There is a city in Colombia called Cali, which is known as the world capital of salsa. And if you want to experience salsa, then I highly recommend a visit to Cali. However, there are many other styles of dance that you'll find throughout Colombia, including cumbia, vallenato, joropo, and many other styles. In fact, many regions of Colombia have their own styles of dance. Something I noticed as a former teacher who used to work in schools, many Colombian children learn dance from a young age. So there are children that are in primary school that can dance much better than me. I'm kind of embarrassed. So after many years of growing up dancing all these different styles of dances, Colombians put me to shame, and they might put you to shame on the dance floor. I wish I could dance like a Colombian. Moving on to number three, it's dangerous everywhere. Now this one is false. This stereotype comes from Colombia's kind of dark history with drug cartels, gangs, wars. There has been a lot of violence in Colombia's past, and a lot of Colombians have suffered due to that, but Colombia has modernized so much, and even in just the 12 years that I've been here, I've noticed massive improvements in security. In 2016, the Colombian government signed a peace treaty with one of the biggest paramilitary groups here. That has allowed more of the country that used to be controlled by these paramilitary groups to be open to tourism. So there are places that you couldn't visit 15, 20 years ago that now you can visit. So just remember, you might have watched shows like Narcos on TV, and you've probably got this image in your head that Colombia is super dangerous. And just remember, Narcos is partly fictionalized, dramatized, and also based on events that happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Colombia is not the same as it was back then. Colombia has advanced so much, and Colombians have worked so hard to improve the security and the safety of this country, and should be applauded for doing so, because Colombia just 10, 15 years ago was a place that very few tourists would come, but now it is one of the fastest growing tourist markets on the planet, and I think that is fantastic, because it's going to bring in lots of tourist dollars to help this country develop more. That being said, there are still a few areas of the country that are not recommended to visit, but you probably wouldn't want to go there anyway. But the major cities like Medellin, Cartagena on the coast, and the capital city Bogota are generally fine for tourism. So yes, Colombia is much safer than you probably imagine it to be, and also very welcoming for travelers, because Colombians are very kind and welcoming people. Now here's another funny one for some of you native Spanish speakers out there. There's a rumor that Colombians speak bad Spanish, and that also is false. Of course, there is a lot of slang, there's a lot of expressions that are used in different cities, and even in cities like Medellin, there's a lot of local slang that I don't understand because I learned standard Spanish. But the truth is, people from central Colombia, especially Bogota, have the clearest accent in Latin America. And I actually found out that many of the television news presenters, not only in Colombia, but in many other Latin American countries, come from Bogota because they have this really clear, neutral accent that is easy to understand. So if you are planning to learn Spanish, you could do it, of course, anywhere in the country, but if you want a more neutral accent, the best place to learn would be in Bogota. Moving on to number 5, Colombians are all coffee drinkers. Now, of course, that's false. Not everybody drinks coffee, even though Colombia grows the best coffee in the world, and I am obsessed with it. That doesn't mean everybody here drinks it. There are other popular drinks that are alternatives to coffee. In Colombia, there are drinks called aromáticas, which are like herbal teas, and they are very popular. But funnily enough, tea that we know very well in Australia and in the UK and in America, whether it be black tea or green tea or white tea, is not common here. You can buy it, but you have to kind of search for it. Some of the bigger supermarkets will sell it, but if you go to a cafeteria and ask for a cup of tea, most of them probably won't even have it available. So that surprised me when I came to Colombia. But there's also other popular drinks that are very refreshing, either hot or cold, such as one called agua panela, which is basically water with panela, which is like a less refined sugar. You can buy it in blocks, or you can also buy it in powdered form. And I love panela, especially in coffee. I think it gives it not exactly a caramelly flavor, but it's definitely a different flavor to standard white and brown sugar. It just adds a beautiful caramelly flavor to coffee. I definitely recommend trying it when you're in Colombia.
If you love this kind of video, please subscribe and come along with me on my future adventures.
Myth number 6. Colombia is all jungle and rainforest, and of course that's not true. There are some regions that are all rainforest and jungle, like the Amazon to the south of Colombia, and there's some coastal areas that are tropical, like a place called Tayrona Park, which I visited in 2023, and I'll put the image of that video up here on the screen. That is one of my favorite places in Colombia. It is absolutely stunning, and I really recommend spending a few days there if you can handle the heat, because it is quite warm and humid, but it was one of the most amazing nature experiences that I've ever had. Just walking through that forest and encountering many different varieties of monkeys and howler monkeys and seeing this beautiful dense forest, it was amazing. And the beaches there are probably the best in all of Colombia. It's stunning. But as I said, not all of Colombia is like that. You probably would be surprised to know that Colombia also has deserts, like one called the Tatacoa and the Guajira, which is in the northeast of Colombia near the border of Venezuela. And you might be even more surprised to know that Colombia also has snow-capped mountains, and quite a few of them. Colombia even has one of the highest mountains in the world, and we have volcanoes like Nevado del Ruiz, which is an active volcano, and it's snow-covered, and you can actually climb it at times, but it is still active, so you have to be very careful when you climb it. So yes, Colombia's landscapes are as varied as its culture, but no matter what kind of weather you like, you will find something for everyone, from cooler weather in the higher altitude cities to mild weather in cities like Medellin to warmer tropical areas like the coastal areas and the Amazon. There really is something for everyone. Next one, number 7. Now this is a video that I have and ahed about making a full video about since I started my channel, but so far I've still decided not to do it because I don't want to give attention to this particular person. This is another myth that Pablo Escobar was a national hero, and it upsets me when I hear that, because Pablo Escobar was one of the biggest criminals in history, the leader of one of the biggest drug cartels in the world, and he and his drug cartels and his gangs were responsible for the deaths of literally thousands of innocent people. And the effects of those events that happened 30, 40 years ago are still being felt by generations of Colombians today, especially those that lost loved ones. So when you come to Colombia, please don't mention that name. Don't come here thinking he's a hero. One thing that really irritates me and upsets me is in some areas you can buy Pablo Escobar shirts. For some reason, tourists seem to think he was some sort of like a rock star or a hero of some sort, but he was responsible for the deaths of many thousands of people and should not be celebrated. It's a complex story, and if you do want me to make a video about it, let me know in the comments. But even to this day, there are some people that support Pablo Escobar because he did things for them, like providing them with housing and so on back in the 70s and 80s. And because of that, many people from developing areas of the city thought he was a good man, but the majority of Colombians strongly disagree. Please be careful mentioning Pablo Escobar when you come to Colombia, because you never know if you're going to upset somebody that you are talking to about him. It's one of those taboo topics, and I generally avoid it, and that's the reason I haven't made a video about him today. Most Colombians just want to forget about him, as that was a very dark chapter in Colombia's history. Both Medellin City and all of Colombia have worked really hard to work past that bad legacy of Pablo Escobar. So that's why I find it quite disrespectful when tourists come to Colombia and buy Pablo Escobar shirts and souvenirs. You know, it's quite disrespectful to the local people of Colombia, who are focusing on progress and innovation and community rebuilding. While some tourists come here for the purposes of narco-tourism because they're very interested in the history of Colombia, I understand their morbid curiosity, but I don't really agree with that. I think it's quite offensive to Colombians. There is so much more to offer in Colombia. Look at all the beauty of this country, and don't come here for narco-tourism. Come here for the beauty of the country and for the amazing people, and let Colombians leave that chapter in the past. Number 8. Colombia is poor and underdeveloped. Well, that's a difficult one to answer because some regions are less developed than others. Now, if you're talking about major cities like Bogota and Medellin and Cartagena and some of the other bigger cities, of course, they are much more developed and they have better infrastructure. Some of the smaller cities and the regional towns are, in general, less developed and they have worse infrastructure. My first experience in Colombia, when I arrived here 12 years ago, I was living in a small town of about 8,000 people or so, and the infrastructure was pretty bad because I was living out of the town. So there were days where one day I would have no electricity for 8 or 12 hours or whatever, and then the next day the water would go and I would have no idea when it would return. And also the tap water is not safe to drink in those smaller areas, even though I used to see many young kids drinking from it, but it's definitely not recommended. In the bigger cities, of course, you can drink tap water because here in Medellin and in Bogota and other big cities, the water is clean, filtered and chlorinated. So yeah, it really does depend on where you want to live. If you're planning to live in a big city, or if you're planning to visit a big city, you shouldn't have any issues at all with the infrastructure. Or if you come to Colombia to live or retire and you decide you want to live in a rural area, just beware that you might have some of those problems. And internet is not as widely available as it is in other countries, so that's another thing to consider. But one thing you might not know about Colombia is that it is the 4th biggest economy in Latin America, with many industries ranging from tech startups to luxury goods. Cities like Bogota and Medellin are booming, and this country is a leader in export of flowers and emeralds, and of course, coffee. While economic inequality is still a problem in Colombia, it is far from being in extreme poverty like it was in the past. The general quality of life is improving year by year for the majority of Colombians. Number 9, it's always hot in Colombia. Absolutely false. That really does depend on where you want to live, because as I mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to go into depth again about it, Colombia is a relatively small country. However, it has high peaks, high mountains, down to sea level areas where it's very hot and tropical. So there really is something for everybody. So if you want to live in a cooler city because you like colder weather, go for somewhere like Bogota where it's a higher altitude. If you like spring weather all year round like I do, I chose Medellin, so you would enjoy Medellin. If you enjoy hot tropical weather, then perhaps one of the coastal cities on the Caribbean or Pacific coast would be better for you. But you might be surprised to know that Colombia also has deserts like the Tatacoa, like Guajira, and also snow-capped mountains and volcanoes. You probably wouldn't have pictured being able to ski or seeing snow in Colombia, but it's true. And unlike my home country, Australia, where you would literally drive for hours and hours and hours and hours to see any difference in the weather in Colombia changes very quickly depending on the altitude. For example, just 1 to 1.5 hours north of Medellin. There's a town called Santa Fe de Antioquia, which is a really beautiful place, and I recommend visiting it. I made a video about it, which you can check out after this one. But in just that short distance of 1.5 hours, because you're going down the mountain, the weather changes dramatically. So here in Medellin, it might be 25 degrees, for example, but when you get to Santa Fe, it will be about 35 degrees, about 10 degrees difference in 1.5 hours, which is quite fascinating for me as an Australian, because my home country is very flat, very big. So to see big changes in weather, you have to fly for hours. So it's interesting, but yeah, there really is something for everyone when it comes to weather in Colombia. Moving on to number 10, this one's just for fun. Colombians wear ponchos and sombreros all the time. This one's ridiculous. I've been living in Colombia for 12 years and I think I've seen people wearing ponchos probably 2 or 3 times, but generally more in the rural areas. By the way, if you don't know what a poncho is, I'll put an image on the screen. And a sombrero is a hat, like a big wide brimmed hat. Here in cities like Medellin, where the weather is quite mild, there's no need for that kind of clothing. But yes, you might see people wearing them in rural areas, but in general, most Colombians dress casually, like most people around the world, in jeans and shirts and so on. By the way, if you do come to Colombia, Colombia has an excellent clothing industry. You can buy very good quality clothing at very low cost, so bring an extra empty suitcase and fill it with clothing to take home, because it's very well priced and good quality. So that's the end of this video, guys. If there are any other myths that you've heard that I didn't include in this video, please put them in the comments, because maybe I can make a part 2. That would be fun. This has been a fun video to make. As always, thank you so much for watching, subscribing, and I ask you, please give this video a like. It really, really helps. And as always, see you in the next video. If you'd like to become a supporter of this channel so I can make more videos more often, please click the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description box below. Thanks a million for your support.